him for yourself. But what about just from a scholarly viewpoint? What about from a skeptic's viewpoint? Can we know if Jesus really existed? It's interesting that Professor Bart Ehrman, who's a famous agnostic New Testament scholar, wrote a book saying, yes, of course Jesus existed. All the evidence is there that he existed. And this man is a famous agnostic who even attacks the New Testament. So he's saying, of course, the evidence says Jesus existed. So let me lay out a few things as to why we're so confident historically, from a scholarly viewpoint, that Jesus lived and died and rose from the dead. The first thing is that the New Testament documents are the most wonderfully preserved documents from the ancient world. You have things about ancient Roman history and ancient Greek history, and the only manuscripts we have are from hundreds and hundreds of years later, and sometimes they're only a handful. With the New Testament, the earliest manuscripts are within a generation of the death of the authors of the New Testament. That's kind of unprecedented. And we have thousands of manuscript copies. And even though between them there are tiny copyist errors and things like that, and you know, one thing would spell Mr. M-I-S-T-E-R and another M-R dot, the fact is they're in essential harmony on all the foundations. That's amazing. So it's the best attested book from the ancient world. Not only so, but scholars have seen that the accounts we have in the Gospels are eyewitness accounts. And Luke talked to the eyewitnesses and researched and got the information to get things accurate. So it's not like, say, Muhammad, hundreds and hundreds of years later, claiming to get revelation from God and telling us what happened in Jesus' day or telling us what happened in Moses' day. These were the eyewitnesses. And there's even something called the criterion of embarrassment. In other words, if something in the document is embarrassing to the hero of the story, you don't expect to see it. When you read the ancient accounts of the great heroes of old, the mythological accounts, they don't have the blemishes and the faults, and yet these eyewitness accounts tell you all the failings of the disciples. Why would you do that if you're launching a movement, talk about all the flaws and failings of the disciples? When Jesus dies, they don't get it. They flee. When he rises, they don't believe it initially until they see him. Why put all this in there? It's because they're accurate accounts of what really happened. Now, as far as outside sources, remember, this was not like today. You didn't have people with cell phones reporting immediately. You didn't have people tweeting stuff out. You didn't have CNN with 24-hour news. So the historians wouldn't write about things in their own day, the great historians of old. They would generally wait, and then they would look back at the earlier days and write their histories about what happened. So when we begin to have attestation of Jesus dying, or this one called Christ, some didn't know what to make of the name, with him dying, and then reports of his resurrection, or his early followers being devoted to him and willing to die for him. You have the outside sources, the outside Greek and Roman sources. You even have outside Jewish sources that attest to Jesus dying, even Jewish leadership giving him over to die at the time of the Passover. So these are non-believing sources, some of them hostile, yet they report the same essential truths, the foundations of our faith. And not only so, the idea that in ancient Rome you would start a new religion where your founder dies a criminal's death, that was a scandal of all scandals. Then, to the Jewish world, expecting a Messiah who would rule and reign to preach this, these were stumbling blocks. You don't invent that, and you don't invent a virgin birth. You find me another religion where the founder comes from a virgin birth. These things would be scandalous, as if you were covering up some kind of immorality. These are not the kind of things you invent. And then if the whole thing is a myth, you don't die for it. You're not tortured to death for it because you know the whole thing is a myth. So all of these things are looked at just in an academic, serious way so that people say, yeah, the evidence would say that Jesus existed, that he was known for healings and exorcisms, that he died, that his followers claim that he rose from the dead. None of these things have ever happened in this way with any other religion, especially with eyewitness testimony. And then there's the last thing. There's the prophetic word. The prophetic word. You say, well, how do we know he was born in Bethlehem? Prophet said so, but how do we know it happened? We could argue about that. How do we know he was a miraculous birth? We could argue about that. But the prophets also indicated in the Old Testament that the Messiah would be rejected by his own people and then would be received by the Gentile world before his own people would receive him back, and that he had to come and die before the second temple was destroyed. So how do you plan that out? How do you make that happen? Second Temple was destroyed in 70 AD. How do you make these things happen and then you get rejected by your own people and then accepted by more than 2 billion people around the world? You can't quite manufacture that. All the evidence says what the New Testament tells us really happened. So not only are we sure in our hearts, we're sure in our minds also.